Around 800 BC, something remarkable took place in Greece. Greece suddenly returned to life. It returned from the dead, so to speak, and underwent a renaissance. The reason? We don't exactly know why, but it had something to do with an increase in the size of its population. Population size materially affects the quality of everyday life. As the population increases, communications improve, individuals develop a specific expertise, and societies become more stratified. Some archaeologists have suggested that in the first half of the 8th century, the population of Attica, the territory surrounding Athens, quadrupled, and that in the next half-century, it almost doubled again. Or this may be an exaggeration. Very rarely in history has the human birth rate ever increased at such a startling rate. Even so, it's incontestable that the population of the Greek-speaking world did indeed expand, though why it did is yet another mystery. It may in part have been due to the fact that the production of grain replaced animal husbandry as the main means of farming. Whereas an ox or a cow needs a lot of land to graze on and is only good for a few meals, grain can sustain a much larger population. Greek society now became dominated by aristocrats who came to acquire large estates. But what about ordinary people? In fact, we know a great deal about how ordinary Greeks lived from literature, vase paintings, inscriptions, and archaeological remains. It's worth noting, however, that we have only 2 private papers written in Greek before the 320s BC. So in that respect, we're much worse off than we were with the Egyptians, who, as we saw, left us plentiful documentation about their private lives, written some 2,000 years earlier. Because the Greek mainland is agriculturally poor, there aren't many regions that can support the growing of crops in any quantity. Very soon, as the population expanded, the inhabitants were forced to emigrate and found settlements all over the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. I'll be talking about that emigration movement in a later lecture on Greek refugees. So we see here again that environment plays a shaping role in how history develops. But the story of Greece isn't just a story about emigration forced on a people by limited agricultural resources. It's also a mountain story, in the sense that the mountains of Greece favored the development of the quintessentially Greek political entity, the city-state or polis. Polis was an autonomous community of Greeks who considered themselves to be ethnically distinctive from other Greeks. Every polis had its own citizen army, its own set of laws, and its own specific gods. Every polis was also restrictive in its citizenship, denied women what we would regard as basic human rights, and practiced slavery. I'm going to be chiefly concentrating on Athens because Athens supplies us with the most information. Athens, however, was just one of about 1,000 polis, that's the plural form of the word. The city-state that was most strikingly different from Athens was Sparta, although we know much less about life in Sparta than we do about life in Athens. But it's also possible that you, as a Greek, didn't live in a polis at all. You may have been a member of an ethnos, a word we usually translate as tribal group, although that suggests a level of backwardness that certainly didn't prevail among all ethne. Though you might have lived in an urban centre of sorts, it would not have had any of the amenities of a city. When Aristotle in the Politics famously stated that man is a political animal, what he meant was that man is an animal who lives, or who prefers to live, in a polis. Aristotle was incapable of imagining a life lived otherwise. In fact, no Greek ever bothered to describe what it was like to live in an ethnos. Even so, we should take a moment to imagine the life of Greeks whose daily life has left no traces in the historical or archaeological record. They represent the other side of history. They are the Greeks who did not build permanent structures, produced no great thinkers or artists, were largely illiterate, existed in many cases at subsistence level, had never heard of Socrates, and who generally had little contact with the outside world, except when a major war, like the Peloponnesian War, dragged them in because then they became militarily useful. So what did it mean to be a Greek? A Greek, that is, who lived in a polis. Well, it meant you spoke the same language as every other Greek, although in a unique dialect. It meant you shared a common literature with other Greeks, at least as far as the poems of Homer and Hesiod, another epic poet contemporary with Homer, were concerned. It meant you worshipped the same gods as other Greeks, albeit in slightly different forms. So although your city-state worshipped its own particular variety of gods, they derived from the same common tree, so to speak, as the gods whom all other Greeks worshipped. And this in turn meant that you knew the same stories and beliefs as other Greeks did. Like all Greeks, you believed that the gods lived on Mount Olympus. Next, you had the same level of technological know-how as other Greeks who lived in a polis. You also shared the same mental view, which meant, for instance, that you took slavery for granted and had an intense, visceral suspicion and dislike of non-Greeks, as well as, in many cases, an intense, visceral dislike of other Greeks who weren't from your polis. I should explain here that for most practical purposes, being an Athenian or a Spartan or a Theban or a Macedonian or a Corinthian meant far more to you most of the time than being a Greek. You experienced a sense of connectedness to your fellow Athenians or fellow Spartans or whoever your compatriots were that we can't possibly identify with. And there were lots of reasons for this. As a citizen of a polis, you would have experienced a much greater sense of exclusivity than anyone living in the West today. That's because you would have belonged to what anthropologists call a face-to-face community, a community that was sufficiently small that people would have known, or at least have recognized, a significant percentage of the entire community. In addition, the social and political structures of your polis would have bound you much more closely to your fellow citizens, and especially to your peers, than ours do. And finally, you led a life that was much more similar to the lives of all your fellow citizens than we do today, simply because there were far fewer life choices available. One of the characteristics of a face-to-face society is that it puts a lot of emphasis on shame. It's one of the ways in which it instills its value system into its citizens. Shame was one of the things that would have motivated you most strongly. Let's say you're not the kind of person who likes to put his life at risk and that you don't much fancy the thought of fighting in battle. Well, I strongly suggest you keep your fears to yourself. You can't honorably opt out. And if you do opt out, you'll be an outcast forever. A poem by the lyric poet Pindar, who wrote odes celebrating victors in the games, describes the miserable fate of some athlete who let his city down. He's so afraid of being mocked that he slinks down back alleys, hoping that no one will see him. It sounds like a horrible fate. So far, I've assumed that you're a Greek male because Greek society was dominated by males. Let's now talk briefly about women. And I say briefly because I'm going to be devoting an entire lecture to the situation and condition of women in the Greek world. It's a very important subject, and I'm happy to say It's one that has attracted a great deal of scholarly interest since 1973, the year when feminist theory was first introduced into the study of the classical world. As a woman, you would have been viewed by men very differently from the way you're viewed by men in the West today. Compared with our somewhat more enlightened standards, Greek men appear to have been deeply misogynistic, a word with Greek roots meaning hating women. As a freeborn, respectable woman, your place was firmly in the home, and not only in the home, but also inside the house. You received little, if any, formal education, had no political or legal identity, and could not leave the house unattended. The desire of most Greek husbands was to have male offspring, preferably lots of them, and your main function as a wife was to oblige. Gender brings us to sexuality. We tend to think of human sexuality as a given, but it isn't. It's in part, at least, what anthropologists call a cultural construct. We already glanced at this topic in the previous lecture when we talked about Minoan women exposing their breasts in public. In the case of the Greeks, we find a large number of very striking differences between them and us. As a Greek male, you would have regarded it as your birthright, so to speak, to have as many extramarital relationships as you wanted, while at the same time strenuously denying that quote-unquote right to your wife. That's because one of your biggest fears was that your wife would produce illegitimate children, thereby vitiating your line of descent. If you fathered a child out of wedlock, you, as a male, could simply disown it. Again, as an aristocrat, you might well have regarded homosexuality as a superior form of relationship to any that can exist between a man and a woman. That's because in your circle, it often provided the basis for a mentoring relationship between an older and a younger man. You would not, however, have regarded homosexuality as a permanent orientation as we do, but as an episodic phenomenon, a passing phase in a person's life, in other words. You would probably have despised men who committed themselves exclusively to homosexual acts, and certainly such people are treated with utter contempt in the comic plays of Aristophanes. Again, you wouldn't have thought twice about appearing naked before other men, either when you were training in the gymnasium, literal meaning is the place of nakedness, or when you were competing in athletic contests. In fact, you would have taken great pride in your lack of inhibition. It was one of the signs that your culture was superior to every other culture. But you would not at all have been comfortable with female nakedness. You would even have had reservations about women displaying their faces or limbs in public. So when your wife or your daughter went out, you'd expect them to be veiled and fully clothed down to the ankles. And whereas you would not have raised any objection to sculptural depictions of naked men in sanctuaries and cemeteries, you would have been outraged by depictions of naked women. It wasn't until the late 4th century BC that statues of naked women entered the artistic canon, about 400 years after the first appearance of their male counterparts. And when they did, they were to be read, overtly at least, as representations of Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual desire, rather than of flesh and blood women. A situation not unlike that which prevailed until 1869, when Edouard Manet burst the canon with his depiction of a naked prostitute called Olympia. Up to now, I've talked mainly about the Greek mentality. Next, I want to talk about your physical circumstances. We'll start with your diet. As a member of the hoi polloi, you rarely eat meat. The one occasion when everyone got a taste of meat was after a sacrifice. When you do eat meat, you usually eat pigs, sheep, goats, and chicken. Oxen are a rarity. It's only in the poems of Homer that oxen are on the menu every day. Homer characterizes the human race as bread eating, and bread is the basis of your diet. It's been estimated that cereals provided 70% of your needed daily calorific intake. You spread cheese, honey, olive oil on your bread. Olive oil was also your main cooking fat. You enjoy fish when you could get your hands on it. You eat it either fresh or preserved. You're particularly fond of mackerel, sturgeon, tuna, sea bream, mullet, anchovies, and eels, ideally smothered in a fermented fish sauce. Fish is something of a rarity too, however, especially if you live some distance from the coast. There would be many Greeks who never tasted fish in their lives. You also consume a variety of nuts and vegetables, including cabbage, asparagus, lettuces, radishes, and onions. If you're poor, you probably do a lot of foraging for food. You use silphium, that's now extinct. It's thought to have been a kind of fennel, sage, and rosemary as condiments. You've never heard of sugar, potatoes, rice, tomatoes, citrus fruits, or bananas. It isn't just your diet that's pretty basic. So too is your house. You have a limited appreciation of the comforts of life and a limited use for wealth. You might try to acquire some decorated pottery if you have a few drachmas to spare, silverware if you have a few more to spare, and a horse if you have money to burn. But you certainly aren't materialistic. To demonstrate that, when the Athenians made a spectacular silver strike in the 480s, they voted to spend the money in acquiring a fleet. And when, thanks to that fleet, they acquired an empire, they again voted to use the proceeds to sponsor one of the most ambitious building projects the world has ever seen. The extraordinary buildings that grace the Acropolis, the Parthenon, the Propylaea, and the Erechtheion. And while we're talking about the Parthenon, just think of the incredible refinements. They demonstrate that you could achieve a degree of accuracy in making things, both large and small, that is unsurpassed. There's not a single straight line in the entire building. All the horizontal lines from the stylobate or base upwards curve slightly upwards in order to correct the optical illusion produced by a perfectly horizontal building that it looks as if it's actually sagging. All of which is a way of saying that the Greek polis, not just Athens, produced one of the most sophisticated societies the world has ever known, not only in architecture, but also in philosophy, literature, virtually every kind of artistic accomplishment, sculpture, painting, and science, you name it. One of the main reasons why you Greeks achieved all you did is because you put so much faith in the common man. Athens expressed its faith in the common man partly through its system of government. We call that system of government full or participatory democracy to distinguish it from the kind of democracy that we're familiar with today, namely representative democracy. The Athenians didn't elect officials to represent their interests as we do. Instead, each man represented himself directly. Each man could speak in the popular assembly. So, when they needed to confine things to only a group of citizens, like the Council of 500, which set the agenda for the assembly, they did so by lot. The Athenians believed that your socio-economic status, background, education, etc., were irrelevant. What mattered was that you were an Athenian, because an Athenian can do anything. The only thing not every Athenian could do was serve as a general or strategos, since that obviously requires experience and expertise. So the Athenians elected their board of 10 generals by popular vote. You were enrolled in one of the 142 demes or townships scattered throughout Attica. Deme was very much like a miniature city-state. It had its own treasury, festivals, and you'd be expected to participate in the local festivals, just as you'd be expected to participate in the great state festivals. You'd also be enrolled in one of 10 tribes. Tribal membership is the basis of all administrative arrangements. You serve in the military on a tribal basis. And when you attend the theatre to see the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, or the comedies of Aristophanes, you sat alongside other members of your tribe in the theatre of Dionysus, in 10 wedges, in fact, precisely divided up for that purpose. So you would have spent your public life very much as a member of a group and of various subgroups. This meant you could never forget that you were Athenian for 1 second. It was an all-enveloping identity. So to sum up, your duties included serving in the army or navy, attending the assembly, serving as a member of the council if appointed, worshipping the state gods, and, if you chose, opting to serve as a juror. I'd like to give you a sense of what it was like to be one of those jurors, because it was such a characteristically Athenian experience. The introduction of trial by jury represents a truly momentous moment in human history. The Athenians thought they were the first to institute it, and they may well be right. So, let's imagine you've enlisted to be a juror for the whole year. You're one of 6,000 Athenians who have done so. Yours is a very litigious society. It just so happens to be the day of Socrates' trial in 399 BC. Everyone's heard of Socrates. He's one of the most famous Greeks alive. You've actually heard him many times in the Agora, teaching for free. He's that fat guy with a squash nose who looks like a satyr. He asks questions like, what's the best way to live? What's virtue? What's justice? The Roman orator and philosopher Cicero will say later that Socrates brought philosophy down from the skies. I think that's a wonderful expression. What he meant is that Socrates made philosophy relevant to ordinary people. As the son of a humble stonemason, Socrates belongs squarely to the other side of history. In fact, he's one of the first persons of humble origins to burn his way onto the pages of history. But that is speaking with hindsight. As far as you're concerned, that day, Socrates is a busybody. For 50 years, he's been making himself pretty obnoxious by making people like you feel rather stupid, quizzing you all the time and telling you your life had no value. Frankly, your patience ran out long ago. So, a chap called Miletus, along with a couple of his cronies, charges Socrates with corrupting young people, ignoring the gods, and introducing his own daimonic beings. You turn up on the day of his trial and are selected as one of the 500 jurors. The proceedings are directed by a magistrate whose job simply is to keep order. No witnesses will be called. Any depositions from witnesses will be simply read out in court. There are no lawyers. Imagine that, trial by jury without lawyers. Miletus and Socrates will both speak on their own behalf. And as you file into the law court, where the trial is set to take place, the atmosphere is truly electric. You never know what to expect from Socrates. The prosecutor, Miletus, gets up and speaks first. And as he begins, the clerk of the court, who is a slave, removes a bung from a water clock known as a clepsydra. A clepsydra is one of the simplest timepieces ever invented. It consists of two vases placed one above each other. The upper one has a hole just below the rim so that it can be filled only to that exact point. The water trickles at a steady rate out of this vase into the one beneath it. If for any reason Meletus pauses, let's say he asks that a deposition be read to the court, the clerk will replace the bung for as long as the deposition is being read. And as the water drains, the flow alters slightly, so Meletus knows when he's coming to the end of his allotted time. And in this way, both prosecutor and defendant speak for the exact same amount of time, virtually down to the last second. Meletus speaks for about an hour, a bit more, and then it's Socrates' turn. Wouldn't you know it? The arrogant SOB goes out of his way to antagonize you by suggesting he despises the whole process. He has the temerity to suggest that he's performing a valuable public service by lecturing you on your inadequacies. And then he abruptly sits down. Well, the place is in uproar. A lot of people, like you, are outraged. It's now time for you and the other members of the jury to vote. You don't retire to consider your verdict. A jury is never retired to consider their verdict. You simply take your place in line while you wait to cast your vote, which each of you does one by means of a secret ballot. And then, when the votes have been counted, you return to your bench and eagerly await the result. After a few minutes, the magistrate announces that a majority of 60 of you have found the defendant guilty. Both the plaintiff and the defendant are now invited to recommend a punishment. Meletus again rises to his feet first, as is customary, and solemnly recommends the death penalty. Well, you're obviously expecting Socrates to recommend a more lenient penalty. That would have been logical, wouldn't it? But Socrates never plays by the rules. Don't you know that by now? So instead, he recommends that he should receive free meals in the Prytaneum. That's the equivalent of the town hall for life. That, by the way, is an honor reserved for public benefactors. Pandemonium breaks out. He's asking for trouble, and he's jolly well going to get it. So, you vote for his execution, along with 59 other jurors who had previously voted for his acquittal. So more people vote to execute him than had found him guilty. On learning the verdict, Socrates delivers this memorable line: "And so we part, you to life, me to death, but which of us goes to a better destiny, only the God knows." Hearing those words, you suddenly begin to have second thoughts. Did he really deserve to die? Everything happened so quickly, and you got caught up in the general mood. You won't admit this to anyone, but as you leave the law court and head for the gymnasium, you're actually hoping that one of his many friends will help him to escape. After all, that's happened many times before, when an Athenian citizen has been condemned to death. But as you'll discover later, Socrates will reject that easy option, which means you'll be left with your misgivings for the rest of your life. Who knows, you may even have to face some tough questioning from your fellow citizens. I said at the beginning of this lecture that Greece suddenly returned to life around 800 BC. And it was indeed suddenly. There was no looking back. Suddenly, everything started to happen at a much faster pace than ever before. In Egypt, everything was static because old was good. In Greece, new is good, and everything is changing all the time, which means you can date a shard of pottery to within 10 years, something you could never do in Egypt. To conclude, being Greek was a bundle of contradictions. It was about valuing the human potential in what was in some ways the most egalitarian and most free society the world has ever known, though it didn't do to become too noticeable, as the fate of Socrates demonstrates. Democracy too came at a cost to the other side of history. Being Greek was about feeling superior to anyone who wasn't Greek, and one might add, who wasn't male, and making sure you kept them in their place. In other words, it was about belonging to a very exclusive club. In the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about how you grew up to become that exasperating bundle of contradictions.